The process of gathering people to participate in a study, or selecting the animals, or otherwise gathering the item being studied, is referred to as sampling. When people are involved, we might also call it recruitment. We need to understand sampling in the context of a larger idea, though, before we learn about the specific ways we go about it. The population is the larger group that is of interest to researchers. So if we're interested in M&Ms, the population would be like all of the M&Ms produced. The trick, though, is that it's often a little tricky to try to get every member of the population in a sample. Sort of like it might be a little bit of a problem if I wanted to try to eat all of the M&Ms ever made. Not that I wouldn't try. Anyway, so we take a sample of the population. When you hear the term sample, we're referring to the people, the group, or the objects who participated in the research. It's like the bag of M&Ms we buy at the store. When we go about selecting a sample or determining what type of sampling method was used in a study, the first question we need to ask is, does everyone in the population have a chance to be included? If so, we'll use one of the techniques referred to as probability sampling or representative sampling. If not, we'll use a non-probability technique, which is also called non-representative. Even when we have the ability to select from the entire population, we might use different techniques to ensure a representative sample given our population of interest. The most basic technique is what we refer to as simple random sampling. Like a lottery, everyone has an equal chance of being selected, and there aren't any other considerations. If we're interested in understanding the personality characteristics of pediatricians, we'd obtain a list of all licensed pediatricians and use a random number table or other method to select our participants. Stratified random sampling is a little more complex, and it's used when we're concerned about representation from particular demographic groups. In that case, it's like having members of each category in a separate bucket and randomly selecting from those buckets. If we continue with the example of pediatricians, we might be interested in making sure we have representation from doctors practicing in rural, suburban, and urban areas. In that case, we'd use our list of physicians and sort them by location, then randomly select the same number from each setting. Cluster sampling is similar to simple random sampling, but in that case, we're randomly selecting a group rather than individual members of the population. For a pediatrician example, this would be like using a list of all pediatric practices and randomly selecting a certain number of practices, then gathering data from all of the doctors in those practices. Multi-stage sampling acts another step to cluster sampling by taking a random sample from the randomly selected cluster. For a pediatrician example, we would start like we did for cluster sampling and randomly select a certain number of pediatric practices. But instead of gathering data from all of the doctors in those practices, we'd randomly select doctors from within them. This is a good time to mention that some terms we use in research have a specific meaning that might be different than day-to-day use. Random is one of those terms. In day-to-day use, we don't tend to use the word random in the same way we mean it here. That can create a problem because it can be tempting to describe what we call a convenience sample by saying we asked random people to participate, but that would not mean random sampling. When we use random in research, we mean every member of the population had an equal chance of being selected. That can be tricky though. When we're studying people, that means you need to be able to contact every person in the population. I don't know about you, but sometimes it's tricky just to contact all of my family members. So thinking about contacting a group like all college students is overwhelming. That's why we sometimes use one of the non-probability sampling techniques. When we use convenience techniques, we're approaching it just as it sounds. We are gathering data from people who are convenient to access. Our friends and family are often invited to participate in research using convenient samples. Purpose of sampling involves gathering data from particular categories, like stratified sampling, but does so in a way that doesn't result in a random sample. This sometimes includes literally placing advertisements saying we're looking for individuals who would fit certain criteria. For example, if we return to our example of pediatricians, if we placed advertisements in the newsletter for the American Academy of Pediatrics requesting participation, we'd be using purposive sampling. Snowball sampling is a variation on purposive, where we ask participants to recommend other participants. For example, we might ask the pediatricians who completed our survey to forward it to other pediatricians.